Greetings in Christ. My name is Bishop Nectarios, and I'm a bishop of the Orthodox Patriarchate of Nations. Today's topic, how to see a holy God in a world that is increasingly evil. Which is a good question. And to explain this, we're going to have to get a little bit into what the Church has come to understand about the nature of God through what's been revealed to us. Now, most people try to understand the unknowable through explaining things rationally, science and whatnot. But all of life is made out of basic elements. Time itself being an artificial construct, but form, matter, energy, these things all have their piece in creation. But if God is limited by form, matter, energy, time, then he's not God, because these things were creations of God. So, how do we see God in a world that is increasingly evil? The first thing that I would suggest is taking a look at the smaller examples that we see every day. Maybe it is a person that is battling addiction. Maybe it is a person who is without hope, who finds hope for the first time. Maybe it's a person who comes back to the faith. Maybe it might be a single mother with 4 or 5 kids that are trying to survive, and every day is a struggle, and yet somehow she's still doing it. Maybe it's the person that, despite battling depression, still comes to work with a smile on their face because they don't want to ruin anyone else's day. God doesn't just step into our lives in a dramatic manner, because that would sort of void the whole point of the test that you and I are going through every single day. We have to make that decision. Faith is believing in God despite the lack of evidence. All you have are your own personal experiences informing your belief. Now, when we talk as Christians about hearing God, it's not like a daily conversation in our lives, but as we get quieter, we do hear God. We're not hearing voices talking to our head, but nonetheless, for lack of a better term, we do hear. So God interacts with us all the time. Most of the time we're too loud and too noisy to hear it. And what has been making the world the way it is so many factors. But what it boils down to is we started telling people that they have to be vicious. Because if you're not being vicious, cold, and abusive, you're leaving yourself open to being taken advantage of by others. And when we adopted this, I have to protect myself from everyone else mentality, we cut off compassion, we cut off mercy, we cut off respect, because everyone is a potential enemy. And indeed, most of my life was spent in major cities, and then I moved to the countryside. And the problem that I faced was, do you really want to bring this kind of drama and pain into your life when you see something going on? Most people don't. It used to be that no matter what was happening, no one saw anything. And that was because they were looking out for themselves, because they didn't want to attract the attention of the things that were doing bad things in their presence. It was a survival mechanism. Eventually, people came to the understanding that if you're not taking advantage of other people, then you're being taken advantage of by people. And this all comes together to expand out from that. Because if you're looking out for yourself first and everyone else can go jump off a bridge, then you're going to take advantage of people, you're going to abuse people, you're going to use people for whatever it is that you want, and when you're done, you're going to toss them aside, which is only going to reinforce the you have to be vicious and dominating and controlling aspect. So, a lot of people like to confuse Christ and Christians, and they like to confuse the state of the world with the state of God. Well, before I was a Christian, I had to struggle with this quite a bit myself because I believed that Christ was the epitome of the Christian path, and that Christians who are supposed to be walking this path with God were oftentimes the biggest bunch of jerks I ever met. And I thought, these people are following Christ. And if they're following his teachings and they treat other people like crap, then God, who is the epitome of that path, has to be the biggest one. And this was before I came to the faith. And that was because I was equating the behavior of other people with the behavior of God. I was taking a fallible person who makes mistakes and equating that with an infallible being, an omnipotent, all-knowing being. And that is apples to oranges. You know, in the beginning, when I speak of us hardening our heart, how many people do you see with dead eyes out in society anymore? How many people do you see turning away from God on a daily basis because it's publicly fashionable to be, what's the best word? To be cynical about religion or anyone who believes anything. And they try to scare you, you know. They talk about fundamentalists. But the word fundamentalist just means that you follow the fundamental teachings of your faith. It doesn't mean you're an extremist or a violent extremist. It just means you follow the basic teachings of what you believe in. Our society has been teaching us to beware of anything that really has us believe in something more than ourselves, especially if it's not something you can touch. However, it's a double-edged sword because those same people are also telling you you should be patriotic. Problem is, you can't really touch the spirit of a country or a nation, can you? You can't touch what it means to be patriotic. You can try to define the terms, but in the end, this path to sacredness is different but also similar to the path that a patriot would take, loving their country. They understand that their country is broken, that there are a bunch of baboons running it, but they love their country, they love their people. Not so crazy about their government, but they love their country. And the thing is, they don't love every single person in it or everything about it. They love what their country symbolizes, what it means. We already have plenty of secular examples where people love unconditionally something in spirit. Why is it so hard for people to believe in something greater than themselves? It's because of that societal tendency to push forward anything that will contradict faith. And the reason is actually quite simple. Because religion tells them that you are in fact a sinner, that your actions affect other people, that you hurt other people, and that you also have a huge impact in other people's lives. And they don't want to hear that. They just want to go do whatever it is they want to do and be left alone. Even if their actions are selfish, self-centered, controlling, and dominating of other people. Because they're only looking out for themselves. What's the harm? How can that harm be done to them? And shouldn't they, look out for themselves because no one else will? Maybe. However, what would happen if our society was to spend some time focusing on the brotherhood of what it means to be an American? Take away all the terms. You are not an African American. You are not an Arab American. You are not a Native American. You are not a Mexican American. You are not a Canadian American, etc., etc. You are just plain old an American. You're one of us. I mean, you don't have to feel away from us. Would that create a better world? Or would it make people feel like their culture is not respected? I think it's how it's done. But how this applies to the overall topic that I'm getting at is, how do you see God in a world that is increasingly evil? Well, God himself is all good and all knowing, and he's present in our lives at all times. He is in the world, but he's not of the world. He warned us that when we chose to follow him, we would be attacked, we would be criticized. People would take gleeful joy in watching us fall because their impression of us is that we are holier than thou, overly pious sinners who are lying to themselves, instead of sinful people addicted to sin, attempting to follow God in holiness, fallible people who will fall. And what's worse is that we post up our clergy on these pedestals that are so high that when the clergy fall, it's a fall, and they often break. We forget that often it's the ones that dedicate themselves to taking care of other people that are the ones that fall the most. And that is because of what it means to take care of other people, the stress that's involved in that, the questions. Just because you're a clergyman doesn't mean you're free of doubt. Now, the world itself is a creation of God. It is an inherently good and beautiful thing. There is a balance in life. For example, if there were no predators, then the deer would eat the land bare. But the predators exist to keep the deer in check, and then the balance of nature is preserved. In life, we see these kinds of checks and balances to prevent one thing from becoming too much. Now, going with this example of the predator and the deer and the balance that God put into the natural world, we also see that much of life has to do with how humans have interacted with it. Unfortunately, when humans try to interfere with life, we usually screw things up pretty bad. I remember watching a documentary where a group of people thought that they would introduce a vegetarian cousin of the piranha into this island chain, and because it was not a native fish, there would be no natural predators. It's a vegetarian cousin, so it's not going to eat other animals. And they thought more food for the hungry. And what ended up happening was, in the absence of predators, this, I believe it was called a pacu, adapted to its environment and started becoming a meat-eating animal. And because there were no natural predators, it spiraled out of control. Now, here in Wyoming, there's another example, and this comes to me from the people who live here. I happen to be a huge fan of wolves, but a lot of people here, not so much. And the reason for that is because mankind decided to reintroduce wolves to the natural wildlife that exists here. And as the story goes, as I understand it, they took primarily from timber wolves, very large, very aggressive wolves, and reintroduced them into the wild and protected them. And now there seems to be an issue where these wolves are hunting prey out of control, and there are no natural checks and balances, and apparently these creatures kill but don't always eat their prey. They just kill and kill and kill. And I've heard this from a variety of people, a lot of them hunters, a lot of them ranchers and farmers, people who have livestock, and there's been some issues with campers getting attacked too, because they're wandering into the territory of wolves. Humanity always thinks that they have the hubris to replace God, or in some way to moderate his behavior. But it was our actions that drove the wolves in this area originally into basically extinction. And we decided to ignore the consequences of our actions and reintroduce another species in that is about as related to the wolves that used to live in these areas as I am to a bodybuilder. The result was the lands were ate bare. Humans have to give up the idea that they know more than God. And that requires being humble. And because that's not likely going to happen on any grand scale in our time, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to first understand that God is separate from the world that He created. After you figure out that God is separate from the world that He created, the next thing is going to be recognizing that the people who follow God are fallible, finite beings. They make mistakes. And you have to be able to focus on your own spiritual life and in your own spiritual development. And the reason for this is that when you're focused on everyone else and what they're doing, you're not focused on your own spiritual life and development. This doesn't mean you tolerate sin. This doesn't mean that you accept evil. As a matter of fact, turning a blind eye to evil is just as sinful as committing it, for a whole different reason. But what it does mean is that there would be a lot less evil if people were to work on themselves, develop themselves, were to stop allowing the world to convince them that they must wall off the rest of the world in defense of their own selves. That doesn't mean you be stupid and you tempt the Lord, but it does mean that treating everyone as an enemy usually means that they'll feel that and start to react properly. And by properly, I mean sinfully. The reason why I say properly is because that is what the world expects of them. You have to break that cycle. You have to be the one to set aside the ego. You have to be the one to work on yourself. You have to be the one to forgive even when you don't want to. And truly forgive, not just in your head, but in your heart. And if you can't do that, then you need to take the time to do that. Because once you start forgiving other people, it's step one. I mean, if you can't forgive other people, that means you can't really forgive yourself for the things that you've done either. And people will challenge me on that, but I will stand by that 100%. If you can't forgive yourself, you can't forgive other people. And vice versa, if you can't forgive other people, it results from you not being able to forgive yourself for the things that you've done in your life. Because at the end of the day, we are all of us connected. I know how much of a cliche that is, but it's true. I remember a few years ago they did out that research study that said that every human on the planet is connected to every other human on the planet by no more than 5 connections or something like that. And if you think about it, that's pretty monumental. I am connected to some person in some country that I've never heard of through 5 connections. And taking into account things like Facebook, for example, it might probably be true. We have such heavy interaction with other people in places that we've never traveled to before that we are more connected to the world than ever before. But that also means that the world appears smaller because news from other parts of the world now comes to us. So, to pull us on track, the question was how to see a holy God in a world that is increasingly evil. As I said, all of these things that I mentioned must be done. And once you're at that point, you need to start working on your connection with God. If you don't ever talk to God in prayer, is it any wonder why you don't hear Him? I mean, how do you expect to have a relationship with someone that you never talk to? You must talk to God on a daily basis. Even if you don't use a fancy, formalized prayer, just talk to God. God, everyone is worried about the last judgment. What God is God is like a father whose child is taking his or her first steps. And God is sitting there on one knee with his hands held out, trying and excited about his created children taking their first steps. God has invested millennia in our development as human beings. And we're approaching an age where we're going to come into a spiritual maturity with Him. At the time of Adam and Eve, we were infants. We had God personally caring for us on a day-to-day basis, person to person. And then during the times of the Old Testament, we were young children. We had stern rules in place. And then the rules started to replace the spirit of those rules. So now we're young adults in the New Testament church, and this is where we have far less rules. And if we follow these far less rules, then we will accomplish what all of the rules of the Old Testament were meant to do. And in the life that is to come, we're going to be adults. Now is the time for us to listen. And while we're on the subject of seeing God, we have to learn to see holiness in the world around us. To see it in such things like a mother with 5 children struggling to pay the bills, who still believes, who still hopes. How about the classic example of a single mother who works herself to the bone every single day so that her child can do something like go to med school or law school, etc. And, herself lives her entire life very frugally, sacrificing everything so that her children could have that chance. That's love. Self-sacrificial love for another so they have the opportunity to become something else, something greater. That is one example of how you can see God in our world. We've been taught to be loving, to be kind, to be self-sacrificial, to think of others more than ourselves. And we have forgotten that because, as I've explained over the course of the video, we have been encouraged to think of other people as enemies and opposition, or at the very least suspect and risky. We've forgotten to love our enemies, to pray for others, and because of that, we get so noisy that we just cannot hear God in our life. So, let me make this suggestion to you because we're getting to near the end of this video. The next time you want to hear God in your life, take some time. Go somewhere very quiet and peaceful. And I want you to sit there and I want you to go through your life. Examine how you've treated other people. I want you to pray, and I want you to ask God for clarity and guidance, and then I want you to pay attention to what happens next. And you will receive an answer to your prayer. It will not be God sending an angel down to knock on your door with like a little envelope that says yes or no, but you're going to receive clear instruction. Because God influences us through each other. God influences us through the little things that happen in our life. I remember when I was a child, my mother used to tell me that God is in the ironies of life. And she was right. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? I think, as I've stated, that you cannot find God if you cannot first listen and hear. And I think that you cannot find God if you do not train yourself to identify those things in life that are sacred and holy. And if you recover sacredness and you learn how to be silent and how to listen, and if you learn to follow God and be loving towards other people, you will hear God in your life. And then the world will simply not matter, because the world is just a creation. It exists for a reason. And one day, the world will be remade. And what then? Because there will only be God and sacredness and holiness, and you won't have to deal with sickness and death and dying and fear and hunger and paranoia. You will be free. And that is the ultimate promise that has been made to us. Not everyone will find their way there. And that very few people probably out of the entire history of the world will find their way there, because very few people are stopping to ask these questions. Follow God. Love other people. Learn sacred silence. Listen. Obey God in the surety of your own heart. And think about other people more than yourself. Because if there was a little bit less selfishness in this world, there'd be a little bit more trust in this world, wouldn't there? Anyway, that's it for today. God loves you and I love you. Now, my name is Bishop Nectarios. I'm a bishop in the Orthodox Patriarchate of Nations. And I would like for you to hit the like and subscribe button. There is a lot of new videos coming out. As I said in my earlier video, I had to take a few weeks just to do what I was talking about today, to think about where I'm at, what's going on, to refocus, because the current political situation was so upsetting that I was becoming vicious, and I had to refocus on what my duties are, who I am. And I found that when I did that, my life was far more peaceful, and I was back on track. Take care, everyone. God bless. I'll see you next time.